Having children is immoral. At least, that's the main conclusion of antinatalism, a philosophy that says that the badness and suffering inherent in human life leaves us all with a moral duty not to procreate and therefore contribute to that suffering. But today I want to take a look at the arguments in favor of antinatalism and see if they're any good. And spoiler alert, I think the arguments don't actually work. This is Frank Philosophy, and today we'll be speaking frankly about antinatalism. So in a recent paper on the topic, philosopher Andrea Sauchelli defends a view that he calls axiological pessimism, which is just a fancy way of saying that human existence is overall bad. It's not bad in every single case or for every single life, it's just bad on balance. There's more disvalue than value in being born, generally speaking. And this position leads to the antinatalist conclusion that we are morally obligated not to procreate, since procreation will just lead to more of this badness on balance. Now, axiological pessimism isn't actually a new view. It was debated by various German philosophers in the late 19th century, like Arthur Schopenhauer. Buddhists kind of believe a version of it. Life is suffering, after all. And more recently, philosopher David Benatar has built an entire career out of defending this view. So there's a long philosophical tradition of looking at the human condition and concluding that we probably would have been better off not ever showing up. Now, there's no shortage of objections to both views, the pessimism view and the antinatalism view. And a lot of the objections have to do with how we add up all the suffering, and how it could possibly be outweighed by all the goodness in life, or at least rationally justified. So waking up your exhausted wife to show her a funny position that your newborn is sleeping in. Waking her up certainly causes some initial short-term suffering that she's probably not very happy about, but it's a pain that she might eventually approve of given the preciousness of the moment that you're sharing with her. Now extrapolate a case like that over the course of all of human civilization, and you might be able to outweigh or at least justify the suffering in the world on rational grounds. Now that's just one way of dealing with the issue, and there's all sorts of other ways in the neighborhood that we're not going to talk about today. Because in the paper, Sauchelli wants to avoid this whole line of attack by introducing a new concept that isn't susceptible to it. Specifically, he introduces the idea of a supreme evil, which is a kind of evil that is immune to all worries about justification or suffering by appealing to some other good. A supreme evil is a kind of badness that is so evil, so bad, so immense that no amount of goodness can possibly outweigh it or justify it. His paradigmatic cases are things like the Holocaust, genocide, the Holodomor famine, mass torture, things like that, truly awful stains on human history. And the idea is that these kinds of evils can't possibly trade against any goods at any exchange rate. There's no number of happy birthday parties or no amount of ice cream in the world that could possibly outweigh all the suffering and make up for something as awful as the Holocaust. The math just isn't there. No amount of goodness somewhere else in the world can outweigh or justify it. It is a supreme evil. Now, if you look at human history and the laundry list of atrocities and supreme evils that we've been party to, it's not hard to conclude that that's just who we are. This is just what we do. And this is probably what we're going to keep doing for as long as we exist. And furthermore, if there's something that we can do to stop it, by namely not procreating, then we're morally obligated to do that. So here's the argument that he gives in 2 steps. Step 1, we have a collective duty to stop the procreation of any species that produces and suffers supreme evils. Humans are one such species, therefore we have a collective duty to stop human procreation. Step 2, refraining from having kids is one of the most effective ways for an individual to participate in that collective duty. So in most cases, we should refrain from having kids. Now again, the argument doesn't depend on every life being bad at the individual level. It doesn't depend on whether you personally are happy with your life. It just depends on the existence of supreme evils, and the fact that we should all work to stop them from happening. Sauchelli also handles the most obvious objection right away. People are going to say things like, but my kid will be grateful to be alive. They'll consent to existing, just like I do now. But that's not enough, according to Sauchelli. The fact that someone you bring into the world would approve of being born doesn't outweigh the fact that they'll be part of a species that suffers and contributes to supreme evils. Supreme evils are just too big to be outweighed by an individual gratitude in one's own life. So that's the argument. It's careful, it's sophisticated, it's rigorous, and the conclusion is that we have a collective duty to stop procreating so we can phase out the human race. We ought to do this gently and as painlessly as possible, and without morally wronging all of the people who are currently here, but still, we ought to do it nonetheless. And so I want to take this argument seriously because I think it deserves to be taken seriously. But I think it doesn't work for at least 3 reasons, so I'm going to go through each of them now. The first problem with the argument has to do with the moral framework that it assumes and doesn't actually argue for. So in the paper, Sauchelli is relying on what philosophers call a consequentialist moral framework. Morality, fundamentally, on this view, is about managing outcomes, specifically those that have to do with suffering or well-being. But this is only one way to think about morality, and it's not the only way. And once you notice that consequentialism is a choice rather than the default, you might be less convinced by the rest of the argument. Consider a different framework associated with the philosopher Immanuel Kant. For Kant, morality isn't about outcomes at all. Instead, it's about utilizing the right principles to guide our actions. It's about obeying the moral law, specifically the categorical imperative. It's about treating other rational beings as rational beings, and not merely as tools to achieve your goals. And if having children doesn't violate that moral law, then any good or bad consequences that any child might suffer or contribute to later on down the line just isn't morally relevant. For Kant, the goal of morality isn't to minimize suffering, it's just to act on principles that respect the moral law. Or consider a virtue ethicist, like someone in the tradition of Confucius or Aristotle. For them, the relevant moral question isn't what outcomes will this produce. Instead, it's how does this action relate to virtue? How does this action relate to courage, generosity, hope, love, or practical wisdom? And we can ask ourselves, does raising a family and doing the hard but beautiful work of parenthood seem like something a virtuous person would reject in favor of phasing out the human species? Probably not. That's a totally alien orientation to the virtue ethics tradition. And so once again, the amount of suffering that may or may not happen elsewhere in the world or in history just isn't relevant for our everyday moral decision-making. Now these are just 2 examples, and there could be many others, but the point is just that Sauchelli's argument relies on a premise about what morality is ultimately about that we don't have to accept, and many philosophers don't accept. The argument only works if you accept that morality is fundamentally about managing outcomes. If you don't, if you think it's about obeying the moral law or respecting rational individuals or cultivating virtue or acting on moral reasons, then the argument might not work for you. And it's not because these evils aren't real, it's just because maybe morality doesn't work that way. Okay, but suppose we grant Sauchelli's consequentialist overall moral framework. Even then, there's still a problem from how he gets from the premise that humans cause supreme evils to the conclusion that I have a duty to not have any kids. And it has to do with the nature of moral responsibility. The main analogy he gives has to do with climate change. Specifically, it's about how climate change justifies collective duties to do things like reduce our emissions, even if no individual emission makes much difference on its own. Or if climate change isn't your thing, think about something like not littering or following traffic laws when you're driving. If we want to keep our towns clean and our roads safe, you might think that we have a duty to pick up after ourselves, to not litter, and to stop at red lights. And each of those individual acts contribute to morally relevant outcomes, like maintaining the cleanliness and safety of our environments. And if we accept that those are good goals to have, we might accept that we have a duty to contribute to those goals. We all have a moral reason to do our part to keep the roads safe. But the analogy between these examples and procreation just doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because of moral autonomy. When I stop at a red light, my action directly contributes to the morally relevant goal of keeping the road safe, even if only in a very small way. The causal chain goes directly from me, to my car, to the other drivers on the road. My act directly contributes to maintaining road safety. To give another example, think about vegetarianism. My choice not to eat meat indeed reduces the amount of animal suffering in the world. Again, even if only in a tiny respect, and even if only indirectly. But procreation is structurally different. When I have a child, I bring into existence a future rational agent. Someone who will grow up and make their own choices about how to live and what to do. Whatever evils that person ends up committing or suffering will be the product of their or someone else's free, autonomous decisions. And they'll be making those decisions in circumstances I can't predict and in a world I won't live in. Their evils, if there are any, will be theirs, not mine. And this isn't a cop-out, this is just how we think about moral responsibility. We normally don't trace moral responsibility through chains of autonomous individuals, except in extreme circumstances. Cases where a mass killer's parents get arrested are very rare. Think about a doctor who saves a patient's life, and 20 years later that patient goes on to commit a murder. We don't blame the doctor. The act of saving was the doctor's, and the act of murdering was the patient's, i.e. the murderer's. The autonomy of the person, the fact that they are a free agent making their own choices, breaks the chain of moral responsibility. So the same logic applies here. When my kid grows up and makes their decision, those are their decisions. They're not me acting through a delayed mechanism. My child is an individual with her or his own moral agency, her or his own choices and own responsibility. Now, I know there are exceptions, but these exceptions would have to be way more common. They would have to be the norm in order for Sauchelli's argument to actually work. Because he's basically asking us to accept a really inflated conception of moral responsibility. It would have to be one in which I'm morally implicated in the choices of people who don't even exist yet. People who will make their own decisions, possibly generations downstream, in a future that I have no control over and have no way of connecting with. But that's just not how moral responsibility works basically anywhere else in our everyday moral thinking. The climate change analogy obscures this. It makes procreation just look like yet another collective action problem that we need to solve, like reducing our CO2 emissions. But each morally autonomous individual starts a new causal chain, and the chain of moral causality doesn't extend from one autonomous individual to the next. So yeah, I think the climate change analogy and the collective action approach to procreation is just doing too much work, and it doesn't really survive a closer look. A third issue that I want to raise is about the possibility of supreme goods, because Sauchelli doesn't really talk about these. If you remember the setup, a supreme evil is a kind of evil or badness that no amount of goodness can outweigh. There's no number of happy moments or no amount of gelato that can make up for the murder of millions of innocent people. The badness is just operating on a different scale. And that's, fair enough. I'm willing to grant that. There do seem to be events that are so terrible that they can't be averaged out with everyday good things happening. But what I'm wondering about is, if there are supreme evils, maybe there are also supreme goods. And a supreme good would be the mirror image of a supreme evil. It would be some kind of good that no amount of badness can possibly outweigh. And once you start looking, just like in the case of supreme evils, candidates are not really difficult to find. Think about cultivating a deep, lifelong love with another human being, finding your soulmate or life partner. Think about two people who genuinely know and love each other, who've built a life together, who've raised a family, who've weathered grief, and who've held each other through 70 or 80 years of being alive and together. Or think about eras of prosperity, wealth, and development shared by groups of people. Think about parents risking everything to live to see their children grow up in worlds that they could never even have dreamed of. Or think about moral heroes, people like Oskar Schindler or Nelson Mandela. Is there any number of stubbed toes or bad days at work that balance out the goodness and worthiness of those lives or those experiences? I think not. Those lives, those experiences, and those goods are just on a different scale of goodness from everyday goods and bads. And it's exactly these sorts of supreme goods that many people think make life worth living. So while Sauchelli says that no amount of gelato can make up for having a family member being murdered, sure, fine. But equally, no number of small annoyances can take away from a life of profound love and meaning. Now, whether supreme goods can actually balance out supreme evils is, I think, a separate question. And I'm not really interested in that one here. The point is just that if we allow for the possibility of supreme goods that work structurally the same as supreme evil, the calculation has to change. You can't conclude that existence is overall bad just by pointing to supreme evils, because supreme goods are doing their own overwhelming work on the other side of the ledger. The conclusion that human existence is overall bad has to take into account things like supreme goods, and not just supreme evils. Now, I also want to be careful here, because I'm not saying that we have a duty to procreate because we might be able to generate supreme goods. That would be a bad argument, because most people that we bring into the world don't experience supreme goods. They don't live supremely good lives. And even if they did, there's a clear moral asymmetry between having a duty to prevent harm from happening and having a duty to create some good. Most moral philosophers think that preventing harm is more important than creating good. So I'm not flipping the argument into a pro-natalist position. I'm not saying we're morally obligated to have children. I'm just saying we're not morally obligated not to have children. At least not based on these arguments. So my point is more modest, but I think it's enough. Sauchelli's argument requires that supreme evils exist and supreme goods don't, or at least they don't matter. But I think this needs to be argued for. And the fact that it's not argued for, I think, takes away from the strength of the argument. So here's where I land. Sauchelli has built a sophisticated way of getting from evil exists in the world to we should stop having children. It's clever, it's careful, and it might be one of the better arguments in favor of antinatalism in the literature. But it has 3 issues. First, it requires a consequentialist moral framework, and if you don't buy that, then you might not buy the rest of the argument. Second, it requires that we're morally responsible for the choices of people who don't exist yet. Choices they'll make autonomously and perhaps decades, if not centuries, down the line. And that's just not how moral responsibility works in many cases. Third, his argument assumes that some evils are incomparably bad, while no goods are incomparably good. And this asymmetry ought to be argued for. But given all the suffering in the world and the existence of supreme evils, which I'm not denying, what I think we're left with isn't an obligation to phase out humanity. Instead, we're just left with the complicated reality that most people already inhabit, that procreation is a serious moral decision with real considerations on both sides. And reasonable people can disagree about whether or not they want to have kids. Now, for those of you who made it this far, and good job if you did, Sauchelli's paper is called Axiological Pessimism, Procreation, and Collective Responsibility. And it was published open access in a journal called Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, which is one of the top philosophy journals out there. And I have a link in the description below. Go read it. It's a very good paper. Regardless of my concerns, it's a very strong, competent, and clear, well-argued piece of philosophy. Reading it will probably make you smarter. But that aside, what do you think? Is Sauchelli right? Is antinatalism true and I'm just being uncharitable? Or am I right to point out these weaknesses in the arguments? Maybe they're not weaknesses and I'm just misreading something. That's also possible. Let me know what you think in the comments below. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe for more Frank Philosophy.